The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and I'm Al Warren. Joining me today, we got Mr. John Copenhaver. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing well, Al. How are you?
Well, I'm good. I just got back from L.A., and you got back from
Albuquerque.
Yeah, the big lefty crime.
Left Coast crime, yes, indeed. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it would have been. It looks like it was a good turnout. Lots of people.
It was. I think people were so anxious to get back in person and see people and kind of have that feeling of community. And I mean the writers, but the fans as well. So yeah, the sort of spirit of the conference and the energy was high. So it was good.
Yeah. Well, people are excited to get back at it and see people live and move around and stuff like that. I wasn't so excited about being back in LA, but and 4 flights, and it all comes back to you on the first flight about how much you hate flying.
Yeah, I'll say that that flying, I felt like I was being folded into a refrigerator every time I got in a seat. I was like, this is just awful. I can't recommend flying, but
No.
I recommend traveling or getting to your destination.
Yeah. Vancouver to LA, I was in one of those, there's 3 seats per side, and I was by the window, and I had 2 guys sitting beside me that were both 6'5" and probably 300 pounds.
Yep. Never
My
fails.
headphones, I had lost my headphones, so I couldn't even listen to music. It was terrible.
Yeah. I play the game of who's going to be sat next to me, I guess, the way of putting it. And I almost always don't get my wish.
That's how it goes. Okay. Well, let's see. Now, we have got an interesting guest here. It's a friend of yours, isn't he?
Yes. Great writer, Alex Segura.
Well, let's welcome to the show. Welcome, Alex. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Well,
And thank you, John, for the invite.
Of course.
so before we start grilling you, you've got quite an interesting history. So you're really into the comic book world, and I didn't know how to describe you as a writer. How do you describe yourself as a writer? Like, what kind of writer are you?
I just say I write comics and novels. I write mystery novels. I write science fiction novels. I write all kinds of comics. I've written podcasts. I guess the technical term is like multi-platform. I do a lot of different things, but mainly I write novels and comics.
How do those two connect in your mind?
They serve each other in kind of subtle ways. When you're writing a novel, you're the absolute decider on everything. At some point, your agent's going to look at it. Eventually, an editor's going to look at it. But at that point, you have a novel. You have a full thing, and it's a lot harder to kind of move the iceberg. With a comic book, it's much more collaborative. I think the closest thing to it is playing in a band where each of you have an instrument and you're jamming and you come up with something greater than the individual parts. The writer of a comic book is almost like the screenwriter of a movie. You're talking about actions and dialogue, and then the artist is the director who chooses the camera angles, the style, the atmosphere, and that's a lot to give away. I mean, when you're writing a novel, that all rests on our shoulders as novelists. We set the tone, the pacing, all those things, and you rely on the reader to come up with the visual component. With comics, it's all there, so you almost have to pull back on the literal words on the page because you've got this great resource in the artist. So I like it. I like both for different reasons. Sometimes I want to be in complete control and I have a very distinct vision, like with Secret Identity, and even that has its collaborative aspects. But with a comic, you want to kind of jam with somebody else and see what you can come up with together. And I've always been a collaborative writer. Maybe it's partially because I have a journalism background, so I'm used to like people fiddling with my words, and the ego or isn't really there as much. I'm happy to go back and forth with people. I've written short stories in tandem with other writers. So I guess it's just I'm flexible that way. I'm not saying I'm a unicorn or anything. There's a lot of writers like that. But those are the big differences. And I think they help each other because when I'm writing prose, I'm thinking visually, and that helps me pull back from description. I describe things enough so you as a reader can create your movie in your mind. but I don't over describe for the sake of just having those details on paper. And with comics, I try my best to make the words I do have count, so they feel evocative and complement the art as opposed to just kind of repeating what the art says. Sometimes when novelists come in to write their first comics, they tend to overwrite because they're not used to having that resource or having that visual. So they'll say, Tom walked through the door. Well, you don't have to say that because you can literally draw Tom walking through the door. So then what do you say? And that's a whole different kind of skill set. But
how do you give that up as a writer? But like if you're a fiction writer, how do you give up that, I guess, control to other people?
It's hard. I guess I think, as novelists, you're used to having absolute control. But with comics, you have to go in understanding that you're not in control. And that's almost liberating because you do your part and you pass the baton. Like I'll write the script or the plot. And the plot is just a less detailed version where you're not telling the artist what to draw panel by panel. You're just giving them a general page by page sense of what to do. And that's part of the fun. You kind of let go and see what they come up with. And it's always different from what you expected or what you visualized. And if it's great, it improves upon what you visualize. It makes it something better that you didn't expect. There's instances where the artist, you need to nudge them in a certain direction or you have to have some conversations. But 9 times out of 10, it's better than you had envisioned. And that's the fun of comics, that you're kind of creating this thing collaboratively and it's becoming something wholly new that you couldn't have done on your own.
Well, let's talk about that 1 time out of 10. Have you ever worked with someone that you just thought was just getting it wrong from what you thought it should be? And who was it?
No, it's never been a situation where I'm like, oh, this is bad. I think if anything, my rule of thumb is if I'm working with an artist for the first time, is I go full script, or at least ask them and say, do you want me to do full script? And all that means is like it's written like a screenplay, and you say, page 1, 5-panel page, we're inside the apartment, and John and Alan are having a heated conversation. Panel 1, John raising his arms, screaming. You just get into a level of minute detail, so the artist is going to hit the things that you have to have in the story. So I've never really gotten into a situation where the artist just totally bombed, and I just had to really kind of recalibrate what I was doing. But sometimes you have to have more conversations with an artist than other times. And when you work with someone a few times, you kind of create a rhythm together. So there are artists that I've worked with a number of times that I don't have to explain everything to that level of detail. I can say, okay, page 1 is going to be the lynx jumping across a few rooftops, and then she throws a star and catches the thug, and he falls down, and you close the page with a close-up on the lynx looking surprised. And you can have that kind of shorthand because the artist is going to deliver and pick up on the things you want them to deliver on.
So basically, you're not going to tell me who you didn't like working with.
I don't do that.
Alex, I'm really curious just because, moving between 2 different forms, but they're both being narrative forms. Does it ever help? Does one ever help or inform the other, or maybe get in the way at times? Like you're trying to shift your mind into novel writing mode, and you've been, thinking in comics mode. Like, what's the relationship there? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. I like comics because they're short bursts in terms of the time that I have to put in to create an issue or a script or a plot. And obviously we all know novels are this immersive, all-consuming thing. Like when I'm working on a novel, that's just what I think about all the time. I go to bed thinking about the novel. I wake up thinking about the novel. I obviously have to do things like feed my children and survive and go to work. But, it becomes this all-consuming thing in my mind. And, I create like thousands of song playlists, just so I'm thinking about the book. Whereas with comics, I do think about them, but it's much more, it's like putting a puzzle together. It's like I have 20 pages, only so many things can happen on a page. I can only have so many panels on a page. I can only have 1 action per panel. I can only have so many words per balloon on a panel. It becomes, I don't want to say it's algorithmic, but it's something much more mathematical to putting a comic together, like the pacing of it, at least if you're doing like an action or crime or superhero story. Whereas with a novel, like the blank page is this huge stressor, and it's also amazing. It could be anything. The potential is limitless. So, I would say novels just dominate and that's my alpha project. Like that's what I'm really like thinking about 24/7. And comics are important to me as well, but I can kind of pop in and pop out, and it's not nearly as paralyzing, I guess,
Right.
in terms of like my brain.
The comic book world's really come a long way over the years. Do you like the way comics are nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I think comics are now considered a medium, which is what it's always been. It's a way to tell stories, and I think a lot of times people just assume they are a genre, like there's superhero comics, when that's actually not true. There's memoir comics, there's crime comics, there's sci-fi comics, and I think people are finally coming around to, and I hate the term literary, but people are understanding comics in a literary way. They're seeing it as just another tool for authors and artists to create stories, and I think you're seeing creators really come to the medium and do amazing things, and they have more options. You don't have to do comics only for Marvel or DC or these kind of established places. You can do them on the web. You can do them. You can print your own comics. You can create your own stories in your own way, and the limitations have been removed, and so there's not as many creative shackles, and I think that's really exciting.
One thing that this is speaking with my teacher hat, but I see, the use of graphic novels and comics in the English classroom on the rise over the past 10 years. And I currently teach students with dyslexia and related learning differences, and it's just like amazing what I've been able to accomplish because of well-crafted graphic novels. And so, I mean, it's sort of in terms of education, it's kind of found this interesting place.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, it really has.
I think, I learned a lot. I was a reader that started with comics as a young child. That pairing of visual with words was such a great doorway into loving to read. And, when somebody asks me like, what, should kids start reading with comics? I'm like, whatever gets them reading is good to me. Whatever gets your brain working and gets you into the habit of reading and makes you love reading, that's the way to go. And I think that's a very unique way of telling stories. Like you have the visuals there, you have the words there. It's such a fun doorway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you like the way comics have been transitioned into like TV shows and movies and series and things like? Do you think they do a good job turning them into something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think it varies. I mean, there's a great adaptation that departs from the source material but is still amazing. Then there's shows that adhere to the source material and are also amazing. I think it's I try not to think of it in these all-encompassing terms like are adaptations good or bad. I think overall it's great to have more awareness of the stories, because anytime you see a show like WandaVision or Ant-Man, not Ant-Man, but or Peacemaker, it gets people interested in the source material and it gets people kind of coming to comics, which is always good.
So now your book, Secret Identity. Let's talk about that. What's the basic premise of this book?
Yeah, Secret Identity is set in 1975 New York, and it tells the story of Carmen Valdez, who's a queer Cuban-American woman who moves from her hometown of Miami to New York to work in comics, which is her dream. She grows up reading comics. It's a very strong touchstone between her and her dad. She has a lot of strong memories of going to, the pharmacy and picking up comics, and her dad learned how to speak English by reading comics. So she gets a job as a secretary at this third-rate publisher called Triumph Comics. And this is a different kind of industry than comics today. Comics weren't seen as this literary thing or this pop culture phenomenon. It was very disposable and fleeting. There were no comic shops. There weren't really conventions at the time. So it was a very kind of rickety industry, that people didn't know if it was going to survive. And so Carmen is a fan, and she joins Triumph as a secretary, and she's pitching her boss, who's a little bit of a blowhard, this guy Jeffrey Carlisle. And she basically makes it clear she wants to write. And it comes to a head early on in the book, and he says, look, I have a line of people out the door, of friends that I have to keep fed with freelance, and I'm just not going to give you any work. How would it look if I'm like giving my secretary work? It would just be weird. And then so it's obviously a low-grade misogyny that in his eyes he's doing her a favor, because he tells her, hey, I have plans for you. I have great ideas for where your career should go. And she says, I don't want that. I want to write. This is why I came. And I don't see why I can't have this opportunity. And so she goes back to her apartment. She goes through her old comics as kind of like a nostalgic remedy. She's just feeling down. And a younger colleague, this guy Harvey, who's a junior editor at Triumph, appears at her apartment door and says, I've gotten this assignment from Carlisle. He wants me to create the first female superhero for Triumph Comics. I don't know if I can do it by myself. I know you want to write. I know you're a fan. And Harvey is like her smoke break buddy. They talk comics. They're not super close, but they're kindred spirits in terms of their passion for the medium. And so Carmen's smart. She realizes this is not an ideal situation. She sees the red flags, but she does it. I mean, when your dream is dangled in front of you, what are you going to say? I think that's the root of the beginning part of the story. And so they create this character called the Legendary Lynx. Carmen is fully prepared. She's got scripts ready, half done, but ready enough where Harvey can kind of put his touch on it as well. And Harvey then turns in the scripts, and it becomes a huge hit. But then Harvey is murdered, and the scripts were turned in without Carmen's name. And so no one knows Carmen has anything to do with these stories. The character becomes a runaway hit for Triumph, and she's got to basically take on the role of amateur detective to not only figure out what happened to her friend, but to reclaim this thing that was such a big part of her. I think that's really, when I was crafting the story, that was the only thing that I thought could pull Carmen into the role of amateur PI. Having something that's so integral to her being, this character that she held so close, be stolen from her, and that pulls her in. And there's like in the classic noir style, there's a very inquisitive detective trying to figure out what happened to this man. There's an old flame from Miami that shows up and complicates Carmen's life, and that's really the initial setup.
So how do you experience your characters? So like Carmen, how do you visualize them? Do you hear her? How does this work for you?
It's visual. Yeah, and one thing I also want to note about Secret Identity is that as you're reading Carmen's adventures in prose, you hop into sequences told in comic book form that are drawn by Sandy Jarrell that show you the Legendary Lynx comics. So you kind of see the comic develop as Carmen's story develops, and it's in kind of meta conversation with the prose. But for me, it's always visual. I always think in visual terms of the characters, and I create like these casting documents where I drop in actors that I have in mind for these characters, and that helps me just visualize the story. And that's why I listen to a lot of music, and the music kind of helps me set up, what the different scenes in the book. I can't listen to it while writing, but I do listen to it a lot while thinking about the book. So Carmen showed up to me right around the time I knew my next book was going to be a murder mystery in comics. I kind of knew it would be in the 70s. I didn't know what the plot would be, and then she appeared. And she was just fully formed for me. And I knew that I had to kind of funnel the story through her. And that was a really magical moment, I thought, for me.
Did you do a lot of research for this time period? Because essentially you're writing a kind of historical mystery, right? I mean, it could be classified as such.
Yeah, I did. I did a lot of research about the time, the political, what was happening in New York at the time, just obviously making sure that what happens on a given day in the book, if something of note was happening, just to, echo that, but also just the vibe of New York in 1975. It was a very different place from New York in 2022. It was in financial ruin. Gerald Ford had just told the city to drop dead. Crime was sky high. And as a country, we were in this post-Watergate malaise. I guess the first feeling of American failure, I guess, if you want to really be broad about it. But also there was a vibrant music scene. So I read a lot of books about the music scene. I read a lot of books about, New York in that time period. One book that particularly stuck out for me was Love Goes to a Building on Fire by Will Hermes. And what he did so well was he basically tracked the music scene in New York in the 70s, but not just like, the punk CBGB stuff, but also Latin music, jazz, the avant-garde, the beginnings of hip hop. And in that description, while he's talking about these different musical moments, you obviously get a sense of the city, what was going on politically, socially. And that was really just a huge resource and really helpful. And yeah, it is a historical novel. I think I had to really I wasn't alive in 1975, so I wanted to really make sure that what the book reflected was as close to accurate as possible.
Yeah, I was alive. I wonder So in a way, New York is almost a character you've written.
Yeah. I mean, for me, my favorite crime novels, the setting is but almost as important as the main character.
Now, so Carmen, how do you get into that mind? How do you create a character that's going to play and sound real when it's someone that's not who you are? Like this is a completely different type of person living in a different time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, Carmen and I have a lot of things in common. We're Cuban American, we're from Miami, we both moved to New York to work in comics. There's some parallels there, but we're obviously very different. She's a queer woman, I'm a straight man. I think the best thing, when I decided this was what I was going to write, I knew I would need help, and I knew I would need sensitivity readers. I knew I would have to do a lot of reading on my own to just try my best to evoke this character. But I also, I think a lot of people say sensitivity readers, and they use that as a checkbox, like, oh, I got one, so this is good. And at the end of the day, the ultimate judge is the readers. The readers are going to read it and decide whether you've landed and you've been honest and transparent. So for me, it was really taking the notes, and I got notes. I mean, I had queer women sensitivity readers. I had women that worked in comics as informational interviews during the time that they worked in comics during the time, that gave me insight into what it was like to be a woman in comics at the time, or just a woman in publishing at the time. And I just tried my best to listen, with the understanding that I'm writing a mystery, and that's what it is. And so I didn't try to tell that Carmen's definitive experience as a queer woman. It's not my place to tell that story. But I think in terms of representation and in terms of bringing some variety to the protagonists of mystery novels, it felt like it was a good thing to do. And I just tried to be thoughtful about it. I did as much reading as I could. I spoke to as many people as I could, and I shared the manuscript at various stages. And I just tried to be mindful that I was writing outside of my experience, and tried to be as transparent as I could be about it.
I was on a panel at Left Coast Crime, which I'm not going to remember the exact title of it, but it essentially was writing characters who you aren't, and there were all of us had written characters that were different than us, I write from a straight female point of view a lot, and I think it's really interesting because a lot of the audience, we got lots of questions like, are you worried about writing something that you aren't? Is this something that is always worrying you or holding you back? Or something you feel like you're going to be called out for. And I don't know, when you were, clearly you've done a lot of research and sensitivity readers, but it was certainly something I had to think a lot about. And it sounds like you've gone through a lot of those same thoughts. But do you ever have a reservation or anything along those lines, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think my concern was mainly just doing it well and doing it
right.
And I'm glad we're talking about this, because it's one of the things I was like, I should talk to John about this, because we were kind of running parallel paths with our books, at least in terms of writing outside of our experience. But yeah, I mean, the criticism, your books are always going to be criticized for one thing or another, but I definitely wanted to make as much of an effort as I could to do it as right as possible, or as well as possible. And so I think a lot of that comes with having people read it and having people give you notes on what you might be missing, because it's just not my experience, so I can't think of everything. And so that was my main concern, trying to do it justice and trying to do it well, under the umbrella of writing a mystery,
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you write the same for your characters in comics as you would in a mystery book?
I mean, I think about them and I try to flesh them out the same way. I think it's a different, like I said before, it's more collaborative. So when I'm working on a comic, I usually try to loop in the artist and kind of go back and forth, and they can create visuals as we go back and forth, and designs, and that's really exciting. When I'm doing a novel, I don't have that resource, so it's really up to me in terms of like visual cues and vision boards and things that get me thinking about the character and developing them. For me, it always starts with character. If the character's not compelling, and if I'm just working on a plot, I get bored. And if I'm bored, the reader's probably going to be bored.
In this story here, do you have like a subtext or some sort of point of view that you're hoping people get by the end of the book?
It's interesting. I think the theme, Carmen, it's about her reclaiming something that's really special to her, this character and this idea that she created it in secret and she needs to reclaim it. I think it's really about ideas and who owns ideas and who controls them, and they're often different things. And so it is a little bit of a meta commentary on IP, especially IP at the time. And it's kind of why I felt the need, after finishing this book, to write another one set in that world, because I think there's more to be said about it, and more to be said about it in the modern day, like the commodification of art, and what it means to be a fan versus a creator, and what's the line there. But it's all wrapped up around, hopefully, a murder mystery that keeps the pages turning. And I hope for people who are comic fans, they read it and get a kick out of it because they see all these little Easter eggs and also have a good time with the mystery. And on the flip side, for mystery readers, I hope there's enough there that you leave the book intrigued about this medium that maybe you haven't spent much time with.
You mentioned you listen to a lot of music, and that gets you kind of going with ideas and creative process. What is your process in the sense of... Are you the kind of guy that, okay, so there's nobody home between 10 and 2 today, so I can sit down and write, or do you have to be in a certain mood? Does it just work for you or not?
I try to deceremonialize the process as much as possible because I wish I had, like, from 10 to 2, that sounds like a dream scenario. Usually I'm writing in spurts. So it's like, okay, I have 20 minutes because my son's playing in his room and my daughter's napping, and I can kind of crank really fast, or I have a few minutes before I have to start work. I can, start outlining this. So it's really about how quickly can I go from realizing I have this pocket of time to tapping away at the keyboard. And so a lot of that, I try to eliminate any kind of ceremonial stuff like lighting a candle or putting on mood music or, things like that. Like, and it's not to judge. Like, I know a lot of writers have their method, and my method is how quickly can I open the laptop and start working? Like my novel document's always open. Like, thank God for autosave. But yeah, it's always the quickest path to the writing is the one I try to take because I just don't know how long that window of time is going to be.
John, do you burn candles?
I do. And first, I have to clean the house, and
yeah.
Well,
then I have to mow the yard, and then
But that's true.
I'm a little more precious about it, but I admire like the ability to sort of find that I just grab the time when it's there. It's something I need to be better at, frankly. I tend to...
It's hard.
Yeah, it's hard. And I tend to have to warm up. But maybe if you're just in the habit of doing it, then you get over this sort of idea that you have to warm up to it. But...
yeah, and I go in also knowing, and you probably do too, you go in knowing that first drafts are going to be bad, and I'm just vomiting words onto the page, and eventually I can come back to it. I'm just laying the foundation and putting up the framework of the house. Eventually I'm going to go in and paint it, move the furniture around, and hang up some paintings. But for now, it's really just structural, and I'm an outliner. I don't know if you outline heavily, but I'm a pretty strict outliner, but I try to give myself enough wiggle room that if a character really shines and appears interesting enough that they can move through the outline and change things without disrupting the process.
Yeah, I used to be not necessarily start off with an outline, but then about somewhere between 70 and 100 pages in, really nail things down. And
I used to do that too. I thought it was insane. I was insane, I think.
I think it's insane. I outlined the 2 follow-up novels to Savage Kind, and it is a joy to sit down and just be able to think, not worry about all the mechanics, but just write.
Right.
Yeah. Always, allowing myself to go a direction that might crop up, not being a slave to the outline, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you kind of set up the tent poles and you know generally where the story's going, because I always have to know how it ends or who the killer is or what the big reveal is going to be. I need that. But, you have these markers that guide you, but you can veer off and take a detour. There's a character in Secret Identity that shows up in the first third, and she was meant as just kind of this oracle type character, hinting that there was more to know about Harvey, and I thought that would be that. And then she just kept showing up and had I just gone strictly by the outline, she would have never shown up again. But there were these openings, and I thought, well, why not use this character here? And you know, she became this integral part to the final act, which was interesting.
Wow. So do you actually hear voices?
I don't know if I hear voices. I definitely, you know, I read the books out loud as part of the editing process, but I do try to give each character their own unique sound or their way of talking, and that just comes with the territory. I think I do hear them in my head, but it doesn't ever feel like there's a struggle for control.
Well, I always find it is quite different talking to people that writing fiction. You know, in the true crime and nonfiction world that I write in, you don't really get to choose the outcome. You don't really get to choose a lot of the aspects of the character. It's there. You're just learning about them and trying to portray it. You actually get complete control. There's a certain freedom, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely. You can craft the story as you see fit, and you can tweak the characters as you see fit. I think one of the challenges with Secret Identity is that I really wanted it to have that sense of verisimilitude, where if you are a comic fan and you see all these name drops and mentions in the book, you could squint and feel like this existed in that time. So that had to do a lot with just factual accuracy, but also making sure the characters didn't seem just like archetypes. Like, you know, Jeffrey Carlisle, who's the CEO of this Triumph company, could have very easily fallen into being like this J. Jonah Jameson or Stan Lee riff, or Doug Detmer. A lot of times people ask, oh, is he supposed to be so-and-so? And I didn't want it to be something where they were easily identifiable as real people. Like, I wanted them to feel unique, and that a lot of that comes from voice and how they behave and how complicated you make your characters. Like, there's no villains in this book. There's a murderer, but I think if you read the book, you kind of, on some level, understand why it even happened, too.
That's interesting. It's a really interesting concept. Totally different than what I do. So your process, so you're saying you just sort of spurt and do things, you outline, so you're organized in a sense, you put down on paper, you know where it's going to go. But again, does things in your life going on around you, does that affect the mood and how you write?
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic was challenging. I think I poured myself further into work, and that made me more productive. But I think at a certain point during the pandemic, you also realize, like, I need to take a break. We all respond to stress in different ways. My inclination is usually like, let me just hunker down and work harder. And I had to, there was a point where I just had to kind of slow down because, you know, working harder doesn't fix any external things. But in terms of what's going on around me while I'm writing, I just try to make the most of the time I have when I'm able to write, because, like I said before, I don't know when that bubble's going to burst, you know, when I'm going to have to run and do something else, or, you know, I have a day job, so that takes up a good amount of time, and there's only so many hours in the day, though, you know, we try to fudge that as much as possible, but, you know, I try to maximize my time. And so, you know, if I'm not feeling well or, you know, stressed out or what have you, I try to, you know, I love to write. So there's also that, you know, I think at the end of the day, you have to sacrifice some things to get to write, but it's good that the actual writing is so much fun for me most of the time. So it actually is a balm against bad moods and frustrations and things like that. It's a nice release from that. I don't know if I answered your question there.
Well, I'm just trying to dig into there and see how it goes. Like, because some writers will say, well, I can just turn it on. Like, they've got 2 hours, they sit down and write, it's done. And other writers are, no, you know, there's this anti-mask rally going outside my house. And
yeah, I think I'm more in the I can just turn it on mentality, but it's maybe you know, it's sometimes it's a little harder than it should be.
So you mentioned music a lot. So what does music do for you in your process?
You know, music, like, you know, the vision board and things like that just helps me visualize in terms of thinking of the book cinematically. You know, certain songs will tee me up to think of certain scenes in the book, and I start to move the songs around, and then I have kind of a narrative, a musical narrative, which this sounds crazy, but it works for me. I basically create a soundtrack for the novel, and it's not necessarily songs that are mentioned in the novel at the time. Like, so, I mention a lot of music in my books. They very rarely correlate to the music in the soundtrack that I'm building as I write. And so really it's just to kind of get my brain working and thinking of the book and thinking of the characters and thinking of them interacting. And it's not like dialogue or, I'm not watching a movie in my mind, but I'm seeing kind of vignettes of the book. And that helps me when I come back to the document, fleshing those out and adding details or things like that I kind of visualize while listening to music.
Do you ever go back and look at some of your writing and want to do it differently, change it?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I tend to avoid rereading my older books. I mean, I'm proud of them, but here's an example. Like Silent City, my first novel, finally came out on audiobook recently, and so I was listening to it, and it was cool to listen to, but I think as writers, we just want to move on to them. I'm of the mind that let's go on to the next thing and be proud of what you did before, but, I'm not big on just being retro about it.
Yeah. I think that doesn't really serve a purpose. Like, hopefully we're always growing as writers, so it'd be nice to think that the book, the next book's going to be better than the last.
Yeah, my new book's always my best one.
Right.
Well, there's always that self-consciousness, right, too. Plus, because you learn as you go, and then you look back at something you did a few years ago, you're like, oh, well. But you'll never, ever end that, You're always going to be able to do so. That's kind of a bad process, I think. I don't know.
It's also there's nothing you can do. I mean, I don't want to go back and like George Lucas, my earlier novels, and like rework them and re-edit them. Like that to me seems like a flawed initiative. It's there's no win there. The books are what they are, and they're kind of like time capsules of that moment in your career. And it's kind of neat to look at them that way, but yeah, I don't really look at them that at all.
Yeah, it's better that way. How do you like to interact with readers or with fans and stuff like that? Are you big on social media, big on reviews, website? Like what do you got going on?
Yeah, I have a website. I have a pretty active Twitter account. I'm kind of weaning myself slowly off Facebook. Just I think social media as a whole can sometimes be a little overwhelming, but I think Twitter's a lot of fun. In terms of reviews, I forget who gave me this piece of advice, but it's really valuable. Spend as much time on the good reviews as you do on the bad reviews, which is, whenever I get it or whenever authors get a good review, you're on to the next one. You're like, what's the next one? Give me another one. Give me another hit of this like rush. And when you get a bad review, you dwell over it. You kind of read it over and over again and kind of wonder what happened. And so I try to strike a balance and, everyone's got their opinion. I don't engage with reviews, good or bad, especially on places like Goodreads. And, Goodreads is meant for readers. It's not necessarily a place for authors. I think authors, you can have pages there and interact to some degree, but I mean, everyone's entitled to their opinion, and I try to just let those things breathe. And I engage with readers on social, and if they tag me in a review, I'll thank them for reading. And I'm always appreciative of readers because I'm still in that mindset, even like 7 novels in, that someone spent money or time to read my book, and that's really flattering. Even if they didn't like it, I mean, you spent time. I appreciate that, and I try to kind of keep that vibe.
I'm just thankful people are reading.
Sean, you write it.
Yeah.
Sean lights a candle if someone gives him a I hunt them down and kill them. I use them in my next book.
Yeah, I mean, that is a true crime.
Yeah. Well, I just wonder. So, what is your process when you get blocked, or do you get blocked? I hear some of the authors we've had on say, well, they don't believe it. I've had authors say there's no such thing. It's just laziness, and others swear by it and they get totally blocked. Do you have that problem?
I wouldn't say for a second there, I thought you meant on social media. I was like, well, I'm sure I've gotten blocked. But I hope I didn't. In terms of writer's block, I mean, I just have to work through it. I just have to find a way to work through it. And usually my method, it never feels like, oh man, I'm blocked, I can't write. It's usually just the words aren't flowing as easily as they should be, or I'm just feeling not as efficient at it. And what I do then is I just step away and do something completely unrelated, whether it's like take a shower, do the dishes, take a walk. And that's usually when I kind of pop on my playlist and start thinking about the book. And if things ever get too stressful, I just crack open something I've read and loved, by an author that I really admire. And that just gets me excited about writing. And that makes me not competitive, but want to like add to that chorus, I guess, of writing. It's kind of, John, I'm sure you feel this now coming out of a conference, like just you spend time with other writers and you get jazzed for what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's why that interaction is really important, not just in terms of marketing or just in terms of community, but it also, I think, gives you some inspiration and I certainly felt inspired by this last conference. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, and part of it is I don't have really the luxury to just not write for an extended amount of time. Like, there's deadlines, there's a lot of projects being juggled, and, you never want the work to come out badly, but I also know if I'm working and writing and revising, it will be good or it will be okay. So I just need to get to that point, and if that means like taking a walk or, sweeping the floor to just get my mind off something for a second, and that helps. That seems to help in the short term.
So who are your inspirations besides John and I? Oh, there's nobody but us.
Yeah, that's it. It's just you two. I mean, they're writers that really made me want to write. I read the classics like Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett and, Margaret Millar and Patricia Highsmith. Those are the ones that really are, like Walter Mosley and Jim Thompson, like the books that I would read, and they were just kind of like written by these like legends. But in terms of like people that I've seen and interacted with, George Pelecanos' books were the ones that really showed me you could write a PI novel very steeped in setting with a screwed up character and make it feel different. Writers like Megan Abbott or Laura Lippman, Michael Connolly, and then more modern writers like Kelly Garrett and Sean Cosby, people I'm lucky enough to call friends, Jennifer Hillier. And, that's what I love about the community is that it's ever evolving. You can meet someone you idolize as a writer, and then they start to talk to you as if you're a peer, and that blows my mind. Like, I was on a panel with Laura Lippman, and she was interviewing me, and I was like, is this happening? Like, is this really happening? That it's just wild. And then on the flip side, there are opportunities to mentor writers, and I try to be as active as I can in that space, whether it's doing something like Pitch Wars or being active in Crime Writers of Color or Sisters in Crime or Mystery Writers of America. Like, I want to be as present to other writers as they were to me when I needed like someone to just give me advice. I remember writers like Brad Meltzer or Dwayne Straczynski or Greg Rucka that are Megan Abbott, people that were willing to give advice for little return, just doing it because it's a nice thing to do and you're helping someone kind of at an earlier point in their career. And I try to do the same as much as I can because I think, you just pay it forward.
What do you think? What's the best piece of advice you'd give someone that is writing but actually hasn't gone to the publish button yet? So what do you tell them to do?
Two things. One is finish something. It sounds simple. It is not simple. I went through a long time out of college where I would start a million things, start a short story, start a novel, start a comic book, and then you get bored, as you will always get bored. Once the idea becomes work, it gets less exciting. You get bored. But you really can't play until you have something done. And whether it's a short story or a novella or a comic script, you need to finish it, and then you need to go back and rewrite it and make it better. And that's the initial hurdle. And only then, after you've kind of polished it off, can you really get to the next phase. And I think in terms of that, my advice is, no journey is identical. Everyone says, well, you get an agent, then you sell your book, and then you have a book, and then you sell your second book, and it goes like that. I wrote my first novel without an agent, and it was published without an agent by this very small press in New York. And then off that, I got an agent, and then she negotiated my deal with Polis Books, which published my first 5 novels. And so I guess my advice is that it's not linear. There's no recipe for how to do it. People do it in different ways. People change agents, change publishers, just find the thing that works for you and be mindful that, you can look at other people's paths and admire them, but there's nothing to be gained from just being jealous and seeing like, oh, well, they have it and I don't. It's not fair. And, it's just not how it works. Like, everyone's coming at this at a different speed.
Right. So someone that's never heard of you before, which I find very hard to believe, what one piece of work would you say best represents you, or what would you lead them to? They could only pick one work. What would you tell them to read?
I think it would be Secret Identity. I think it's a culmination of a lot of things. It's a love letter to comics. It's a love letter to noir, a very specific kind of noir, like that Patricia Highsmith, atmospheric, flawed character noir. It's got comics in it. It's got connections to my hometown of Miami. It's got a strong protagonist. It's got pretty much all the things of me in one book. So,
well, did it turn out like when you first have a book in your mind and you're kind of outlining it, beginning and how it ends, and kind of the big things going on? Did this book end up like it was your vision at the beginning?
I think it became more complex in a good way, more textured, more layered. I really enjoyed spending time with the characters, and it became much more of a character piece than a plot-driven mystery. Though the plot is there, and the mystery is there, and there's a payoff and the conclusion and all the things you need for a mystery, but it really became more about Carmen and her quest to get this character back, and that to me felt really resonant in a way that I wasn't expecting.
Well, so let's give out your website and all the information. So where do you want people to come find you?
Sure. My website is alexsegura.com, and you can find me on Twitter at @Alex_Segura, Segura. And I also have a Facebook author page and an Instagram at AlexSeguraJR.
Great. We'll have that linked up to our site, of course, so people can do
awesome.
One click and they can find you and stuff. Any Tinder or Grindr or anything else to give out? Or
no.
Okay.
Well,
I always give the option. So what's next? What's next for you, Alex? What's coming up?
I'm working on a sequel to Secret Identity that's set in the modern day. It's going to feature a new protagonist, and Carmen will be a character in the sequel. It'll have comic book sequences as well, but this is very much the other side of the coin. Like if in 1975 comics didn't have any idea of what to do with characters and IP, they were fleeting and not not important. This is the opposite, where every shred of IP is exploited and profited on, and what happens in that scenario where you're given the opportunity to write a character you love, but you find that the underlying story of that character is rooted in something a little more devious or dangerous, and that's kind of the crux of the next book.
Well, that's interesting. Well, you're an outline guy, so you kind of outline this sort of stuff. How does that work in a sequel?
I think the challenge, I guess if I didn't hate the term, I'd call it more of a pseudo sequel. It is a sequel, but it's not the kind of sequel that if you don't read Secret Identity, you'll be completely lost. I want it to feel like its own thing. And that's the challenge. That's really the challenge, to make the sequel feel like it stands alone. And you would benefit from reading the first book in terms of like little nods and little details that you wouldn't get without it, but it can also be its own thing on its own.
Yeah, because if you bring in some of the same characters, you've taken them through a journey in your first book. So like Carmen, how do you get people up to speed on her?
I think you just have to kind of be creative with how you relay that. You don't want to have like pages and pages of exposition where the new protagonist is just like, well, here's Carmen Valdez who and that was one of the things with Secret Identity. I didn't want it to become a Wikipedia collection where it's like I mention a comic book creator and then I have to drill down and explain the bio. I wanted it to be something where you're just getting the atmosphere. Like on Mad Men, you don't get every bit of advertising explained to you, or you're just riding along and kind of absorbing the details. And so I try to do it that way.
Do you like a lot of the noir? How do I say this? Do you like a lot of the more modern mystery crime writers today over years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got such a great diverse lineup of authors, not in terms of storytelling, in terms of the stories they are telling, their backgrounds. I think it is a golden age for us. I mean, you have the cozy subgenre in particular is becoming so much more diverse than it was even 5 to 6 years ago, or you're just seeing there's so many different kinds of stories. I feel like readers are so lucky to have so many different voices, and I think it's only the beginning, and I think we need more of it.
Do you like the current publishing world, like Amazon and Ingram Sparks, the way it's kind of split now? You've got a lot of the online sales, and then you have bookstore sales.
I mean, I think indie bookstores are the heart of the industry. That's the stuff that's going to stick around. Those relationships with the people that are actually going to hand sell your book to a reader. I think Amazon is what it is. I mean, it's the biggest bookseller in the world, but it's kind of through an algorithm. So that's the inherent challenge. Like, how do you connect with readers when you have to go through this algorithm? And that's just is what it is. But I think the best thing for a book is word of mouth, and that's going to come from readers talking to each other, from booksellers talking to readers, and that's organic, and you can't really fake that. So.
Yeah, it's like the drive-through. Come on, Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, if you know what you want, you can get it there.
Yeah, it's the easy way. It's like the accessible, like McDonald's or something, right? It's not. It's just there. So, well, what an interesting guy. Interesting conversation. So.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, this was fun.
So, the book we're talking about, of course, your newest book is called Secret Identity, a novel. So, you need to go out and buy this. Alex needs to quit his day job.
Yeah.
So get out there, okay? I want everybody out there.
Yes, thank you.
Again, thank you very much, Alex Segura. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tired of wasting time trying to decide what to watch on your streaming service? Go to our website and look for the Martino movie reviews.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Yeah. Good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.